So all eyes will be on the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana as he delivers his medium-term budget policy statement tomorrow. Let's speak now to get the voice of business. Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership South Africa, Busiswe Mavuso, joins me this evening. Good evening and thank you so much for your time tonight. Look, it's not a good time to be going into this medium-term policy statement, not least of which because there's been so much happening economically with the load shedding and the power cuts that South Africans are experiencing. So the mood in the country right now pretty gloomy in terms of what the expectations for tomorrow could be. But what's business expecting to hear?
Kathy, good evening and thank you very much for allowing us an opportunity to share our views. So I absolutely agree with you. You know, Eskom is really putting the country in a very difficult spotlight, you know, especially because we find ourselves in a very constrained environment, you know, where we are struggling as a country to change our economic trajectory. So as much as they've tried their best, and I think we've had conversations, you know, from Andre and the EXCO team around, you know, the efforts and the interventions that they've put in place to try and stabilize the grid, but it's clear that the problems that they are facing are more intense and are much more broader than we actually realize. So our focus from a business perspective, or what we'd like to hear, especially from the minister, is a strong message that there is simply no money for government to be able to spend its way out of this crisis. So there needs to be prioritization of spending on areas that are most beneficial for growth, particularly in infrastructure investment and other areas that will facilitate and accelerate the implementation of economic recovery and the economic reconstruction and recovery plan that we have. So we are currently, Katie, sitting in a situation where our sovereign debt as a country is forecast to rise to 4.3 trillion as at the next February budget speech, which is going to be in 2022. We are currently sitting at 3.9 trillion. And the rise of the debt to 4.3 trillion would mean that our debt to GDP ratio is going to go up to 73%, which means that the cost of servicing that debt is going to be 270 billion rands, which means that a fifth or 20% of all the revenue that we make as a country is going to have to go to just servicing the debt. So despite the huge pressure that Minister Godongwana is going to have to increase social and welfare spending and to allocate more towards the public sector wages, we are hoping that he's going to resist changes that are actually going to inevitably force our debt levels to go higher as a country. And it's been interesting, Kate, because there's been this argument, you know, that has been going on around the fact that South Africa doesn't have a debt problem, we actually have a growth problem. You know, the reality is that we have both. Without faster economic growth, revenue will continue to fall short of expenditure, and we will eventually, you know, find ourselves in a situation where we are overwhelmed by the ever-growing debt pile. And some would argue that the way out of, you know, this risk is to incur even more debt, particularly to support large-scale social benefits, because it will somehow trigger the growth to deliver the revenue, you know, to service it. And this might be true if investors had a huge amount of faith in the ability of government to deliver growth. But the reality of the situation is that the investors don't have that faith in our government to deliver all these things that they've been talking about, you know, at least for the past 5 years, all the critical structural reforms that will actually see our economy leapfrog, you know, all these interventions that we have been promising year in, year out around how we are actually going to make our economy turn the corner. So fiscal consolidation, therefore, still remains central. And we are hoping that where Minister Tito Mboweni was on the path, the trajectory, you know, that he was on, trying his very best to contain our debt levels, we are hoping that Minister Godongwana is not going to actually, you know, allow the pressure from their labor constituency to increase the debt. We are hoping that he's actually going to make sure that he keeps us on the same trajectory.
So, Ms. Mavuso, of course, we're dealing with South Africans, including the public service workers, that have come under increasing pressure. And it's becoming more and more apparent that when one does not respond to the immediate needs that people have, it can lead to its own set of social consequences. And I guess the same would apply even with the extension of social security, at least to cover the majority of South Africans. What is business's position on, the extension of the grant that we have in the country to becoming a basic income grant? Is that a move that business supports?
Kathy, the reality of the matter is that even if we want to be a welfare state as a country, we cannot afford to. So that is not a path that we should even think about. That is not something that we should even, explore any further than what we have done. Do we need to put interventions in place, to assist those that are impoverished in the country? The more than 50% of the population that are living in poverty, we definitely need to, as long as we understand, Katie, that that is a means to an end, and it's not an end in itself. So while we put in place those temporary interventions, let's also be clear that we need to also look at how we accelerate the more sustainable interventions that are actually going to allow our economy to grow. Because without economic growth, we are going to sit with this problem of having more than 50% of your population, that is actually living in poverty, more than 75% of your young people unemployed, more than 44.4% of your population, which is unemployed in terms of the expanded definition. So we agree that both interventions are necessary, but the focus, of government at the moment seems to be on focusing on this welfare state, seems to be on, putting these temporary measures that are actually going to rescue the current temporary situation. We therefore need to look at what are the permanent solutions that we're actually going to be putting in place, and what does the acceleration of those mean, and the issue in the South African context, Kate, is that we are not having enough of that conversation.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. Busiswe Mavuso, she's with Business Leadership South Africa.